this something you learned? Were you born an entrepreneur?
You got to start small.
I have not allowed being a woman to hold me back.
Credibility is not just making money, it's about making sure that people trust what you're doing.
Law practice is not only about going to court, it's about advice.
It's very difficult to hire somebody who's not motivated and then make them motivated.
One of the things that I'm known for is integrity.
They have to see you as a person of integrity.
Welcome to the Executive Lounge. I'm Adjoa Adjei-Twum. Welcome to the Executive Lounge. I'm Adjoa Adjei-Twum, and this is your thought leadership show that brings you nuggets of insights from the lives and experiences of men and women who have scaled the daunting heights of starting their own business or growing institutions, managing them right here at home and around the world. My guest is a banker by profession, but also founder and CEO of EBII Compliance. That's Emerging Business Intelligence and Innovation Compliance. Adjoa Adjei-Twum is my guest on the show today, and she will tell us how she's been working with businesses and individuals in emerging markets, giving them the impetus to ensure that they're able to interface with the developed world. Welcome to the show, Adjoa.
Thank you very much, Adjoa.
It's nice catching up with you, and you were born and raised in Ghana, and then went across the Atlantic
Yes.
to the UK.
Yes.
Were you always looking to get into banking when you started out?
Very good question. I actually wasn't.
Okay.
So I studied economics for my undergraduate degree at Oxford Brookes University, actually, for my undergrad.
Okay.
And so I had loads of friends who actually went into banking. So I had loads of friends from Oxford University at the time. And they went into banking. So I thought, I always knew that I wanted to look nice for work. So that was the starting point. And so one of the, I spoke with one of them and I thought, sounds really exciting. So I got into banking. It wasn't planned, but it was the best accident ever.
Wow.
My first role was actually with Citibank, and I was working in investigations, so anti-money laundering investigations. My role there was more looking at where corresponding banking transactions, so where Citibank was the intermediary bank, and then the transaction happens, but where there is something that is slightly odd, so suspicious activity or something that was anomaly, we would investigate that. So my role was liaising with both the remitting bank and the beneficiary bank to really understand the business activity and the purpose of that transaction. It was exciting. I was actually promoted 2 weeks after to team leader, and that's how my career started.
You started a job and got promoted 2 weeks after?
As a team leader.
Wow.
So I was really passionate and excited, and so that's how it all started for me.
And you did banking for quite a while, did work with Barclays somewhere along the line.
Yeah, so I started in 2007. So it's been about over 12 years now working in banking. So I started with Citibank and then moved on to KPMG. I did a lot of work there. I was seconded to Barclays right after joining KPMG, worked in the global sanctions team, lots of investigation into circumvention, which is where a country or an entity has been restricted by the regulators, and the businesses are trying to go around looking for a way around it. So I did a lot of investigation into breaches, and also helping with policies and training across the bank. That was really successful. I was actually won an award from KPMG for the work I did at Barclays. And then from KPMG, I moved on to HSBC as a vice president. So looking after the anti-money laundering and sanctions assurance across Europe. And while I was at KPMG, while I was at HSBC, I then wanted to kind of move to the US, got a role at the US, and then somehow couldn't sort out, there's a few issues, so came back again. But then I was then rehired back at KPMG, and then worked with them, and then went back to Barclays, this time directly. So that's where I got involved in the investigation of the Panama paper. It was around that time that happened. So I led the project across the bank globally, and working very closely with the regulators and the bank executives to really understand the exposure that Barclays had with the whole Panama paper tax avoidance, whether we as a bank were helping our client to avoid taxes, and also the client that we had, where they, did we know everything about them that we think we did? because again, we have to do our due diligence. So that was a really a very big project. It had a lot of attention, media attention. So we liaised with the US regulators, European regulators, and also the bank executive to really understand that and any remedial action involved in that. So that was exciting. After that project, I moved on to a company called Exeter. So Exeter was launched at the back of the HSBC Mexico drug cartel investigation that took place. They were fined 1.9 billion for failings with the anti-money laundering controls. So moved on to Exeter, but because I had worked at HSBC before, I didn't work on that project. But a lot of the work I did was really growing out the business across Europe. And also I launched the Sanctions Academy, where we could then position ourselves as the subject matter experts in sanctions using the network that we had within the banking sector.
Wow.
And then I went to study at Oxford University. So while I was at Exeter, I felt there was something more. I had so much ideas. There was so much. We did a lot of work with Africa. We tried to reach the African market. So I felt, there is something more. And also from my experience in the banking, I've seen how Africa has been perceived very negatively. Where there is a business activity involving an African person, or even people on the board are Africans, or there are politically exposed persons, something connected to Africa, the level of senior management approval that it goes through, for me, was quite concerning. And I thought there's something has to be done. This, the rest of the world, everyone is corrupt. Why is Africa, what can we do to change this? So I decided to go and do further studies and really be able to get the platform that I can to make an influence. So I then got accepted into Oxford University, which I just finished doing a financial strategy postgraduate degree at Said Business School. And Oxford was another exciting journey. I was voted as a class rep 2 days after joining the course.
Wow.
And so that began an exciting. So we had a lot of prominent people on our class. So we had the CEO of Zenith Bank on our course, a few other high-profile people in Africa. So I engaged in conversations with them, really try to understand the whole Africa and the banking sector. And it was through a conversation that I discovered the gap in terms of how I can position my business, how we could solve the problem. And then I found out that a lot of the businesses, especially when they are growing and they're looking for investment, so funding from foreign investors, it's almost nearly impossible, for them to be able to achieve that, especially their smaller businesses. And so we thought, I thought, how could I should be able to do something to help them, because we can use that as a starting point. A lot of the companies in the African countries, they would love to comply, but there's no incentive for them to comply. The enforcement is, there's barely any enforcement. Everybody's doing it, why not them? The multinationals coming there, they're not paying their taxes, they're taking the money away. So there's very little incentive. So we thought, how can we incentivize the private sector? We shouldn't be waiting for the government. The government have done their best. There's sufficient regulations. People are not really complying, but we need to start individually ourselves. Each company can start and looking at the benefit that it brings to them as a company, rather than to the we start individually, and then eventually, if every business is actually complying, then it's easier for the government. And Africa Rising, we can do better in terms of on international market leveraging and on a few things. So that's how we started.
The three keywords I want us to explore, because it's words you've heard used quite often: due diligence,
Yes.
the perception of corruption in Africa, multinationals being able to circumvent systems legally, and the kind of scrutiny that often businesses from Africa are subjected to when they try to do business outside of the continent. In fact, there's also the lack of intra-Africa trade that I would love for us to explore. Let's start off with due diligence. Of course, a lot of the work you've done suggests that you did do quite a bit of due diligence. What really does due diligence mean?
Due diligence simply means understanding the other, so if you're doing a transaction or business with somebody, how well do you know the person? How well do you know that business? So that is pretty much doing your due diligence, really trying to understand everything about them to help you to make the right decisions.
Right.
So for example, I'm a company, I want to do some kind of business with you, either a supplier, whatsoever. I need to understand your business, is it exactly what it says it is? Is it registered? Are you paying your taxes? Is it being audited? Who are the people that are significant controllers of this business? I want to actually understand a bit more about them. Who are they? Are they who they say they are? Is it any negative news connected to these individuals that running the company, or even to this person, or even to the industry that business is, or even to the country? So if you're a company in like Syria, chances are a U.S. company might not want to do business with you because there are sanctions. So it's really understanding and making sure that you understand all the risk that is involved in doing business with that. And do you have sufficient controls to mitigate that risk? Okay. There are times where it's actually a regulatory requirement not to do business because they have been sanctioned. There are some restrictions on you doing business. So until you do your due diligence, you will not know exactly what you're dealing with. And due diligence can help you avoid mistakes, even negative reputation, getting fined by the regulators, going out of business. Sometimes it's for your own good. You could be dealing with a criminal, and if you didn't do your due diligence, you will not know. So that's
and
simply...
that could come back and bite you.
Absolutely. So that is due diligence.
Okay.
Yes.
So that said, and it's quite interesting, the world over, then in the advanced economies or the developed economies, due diligence is a big deal, but it didn't stop the financial meltdown of 2009. What lessons do you think we can learn in the emerging markets, and especially in Ghana, against the backdrop of a country that has started undergoing some financial services sector cleanup since 2017? What are the lessons we can learn? The regulations are there just as they were in the advanced economies, but we still had a massive meltdown.
I would say, so the western part of the world, we had the financial meltdown, as you rightly mentioned. Before then, they were not investing heavily in compliance at all. None of the banks, it almost felt like everybody saw compliance as more like, oh, this government wants us to like spend money, and they didn't really see the benefits too much to their business. So in most banks, they had very little investment in compliance. It was not, in terms of auditing, it wasn't as strict as it was. The government, especially with the UK regulators, for example, enforcement it was almost non-existent compared to the US. The fines that were given were not a deterrent. It was something so small. So the banks would be happily paying that fine because it's cheaper to pay the fine than to actually invest in their controls. Okay, and if every bank is getting fined, then it doesn't look so bad on your bank because they're all as bad as each other, and people are not going to start doing business because we need the banks. But after the financial meltdown, there was increased controls. There was regulations like on a daily basis. I would put it like it was so almost often. And a lot of the banks increased the amount of people that there was a lot of regulations, and also the government began to pay more attention to what the banks were doing. So I remember I actually joined the compliance world in 2007. Just shortly after I joined, there was that crisis. And I would say like a couple of months later, the same job that I was doing was paying like 3 times more, because they were looking for people.
Did you get a rise? or you just entered the system?
I actually moved. There were very few people in that profession, but the demand became so much because of the fact that there's increased regulations. There was so much for the banks to do, and so that's where the KPMGs and the Deloittes and the consultants. It was a really great opportunity for people to enter that market. Now it's slightly slower because they've all sort of understood now what is required of them. And the enforcement, the US were releasing some huge fines. And I would say 2012, HSBC was fined 1.9 billion. That investigation actually started just around the credit crunch, around that financial meltdown. The lessons that Ghana can learn. So in the western part of the world, everybody lives on credit, okay? But they have proper structures to ensure that, I wouldn't say we had that in the experience we've learned.
That's right.
But I think Ghana, the way the society is built, we are not built around that whole credit system. And I think that's something that we have to be careful about. We don't have proper structures in terms of the whole national identity system, address verification, like, you know, even with like companies, beneficial ownership being online, there's a lot of things that we don't have that they somehow have. But even with the structures that they had, they still have this whole credit crunch.
So the risk is even higher in an environment where we haven't built the fundamental structures. So due diligence becomes...
It's difficult, especially in Ghana. So one of the biggest challenges that we have over there in the banking sector when doing business with Africa is information availability. A lot of the information here is actually on paper. It's not online. Land registries or paper. So it's not easy to kind of find the information that you need from credible sources in the time frame that you need. And so I think over there in the UK, it's very easy. Once you know somebody's, you know, national insurance number or whatever, you can find even the address. You can find every information you need from the government systems to be able to track them, for them to pay back the money. Here, I don't know how. It doesn't seem like we have those structures in place yet. And so we probably have to be a little bit careful in terms of moving in that direction with the whole credit and the mortgage that I believe Ghana has started to.
What potential drawback will a situation like that present both to players in the financial services sector, the government, and more importantly, the economy as a whole?
So you mean in terms of drawbacks from
not being able to have the fundamental structures that ensure we're verifying address details, that we understand the due diligence is up to scratch to ensure that everyone is safeguarded from overexposure?
So in terms of the challenges, so working in the banking sector, again, I speak to a lot of investors, and that's what EBI, we've been trying to partner with investors to try to get them to invest in Africa. There's a lot of money to be invested, especially with the whole, if I'm speaking for the UK, with the Brexit and people are being extremely cautious, they don't want to borrow. There's a lot of money to be invested, but the investors are very cautious in terms of investing in Africa because due diligence is a regulatory requirement in the UK. There's a minimum level of due diligence that you need to meet as a bank, as an investor, as somebody who's trying to do business with another person. And it's almost very difficult. The struggle they have is the risk involved. So the drawbacks is the fact that they couldn't just go online or and find the right information that they need without having to be on ground. So a lot of the due diligence in Africa, you actually have to be on the ground, meet the people, ask the questions, and try to find that information. You couldn't do remotely. And a lot of the investors that invest in Africa actually have a team here who would do the due diligence. So that is the challenge that we have. And that is something, again, that EBII compliance is looking to build that database over time. As we do business with Africans, we will try to then be building that database that eventually we will have that and use to facilitate a lot of the work that's going on from the other side of the world.
Wow, that's fantastic stuff. You know, there was a report which indicated that, I think it was an African Development Bank report indicating that there's quite a heavy flow of finances out of Africa. Do you think that it would stop at some point?
I think it will stop slowly. I mean, if I take Ghana, for example, it's one of the fastest growing economies. The rest of the world, everybody is looking at Africa now, and especially with the free trade agreement that it's gone ahead as well. So eventually, I think it will stop. The problem with the Africans, sometimes, you know, it's like everybody likes what they don't have. So, you know, we have money, we like to go to UK and buy houses rather than investing in our own economy. But I think we are at the point whereby the market is opening up, you know, the whole intra-Africa trade, the growth. I mean, Africa is emerging back. There's so much excitement from the UK, from the Western world about Africa. We just need to be able to really understand how to present ourselves. I always say that we have a very beautiful story in Africa to tell. We've not been very good in telling our own story. Everybody has told the story for us. And I think it's time that we begin to tell our story. And as we do that, you know, the market is open. And I definitely think it will be changing.
All right, we're going to explore that story in a moment. We're taking our short break. And when we come back, we'll be learning more from my guest, Adjoa Adjei-Twum. She is the founder and CEO of EBII compliance. That's Emerging Business, Intelligence and Innovation Compliance. More on the Executive Lounge after the break. Welcome back to the Executive Lounge. I'm Adjoa Adjei, and my guest is Adjoa Adjei-Twum. She's founder and CEO of EBII Compliance. That's Emerging Business, Intelligence and Innovation Compliance. You know, there's been a lot of what some will call rhetoric, and some will also call a potential of where Africa should be. Africa is being called the last frontier. Africa has been rising. Africa beyond aid, Ghana beyond aid. In your estimation, and from what you've seen, you've interacted with investors on the western side of the hemisphere. You've got people who are also on this side who would require some of that flow to grow a business. Can we get beyond aid? Can Africa truly rise? And if so, what do we need to do?
Absolutely. Africa can get, we can rise and we can go beyond the aid. So I actually wrote an article in in the month of March. And it was looking at the illicit outflow of funds from the African continent and what the impact is. And some of the figures that I found was the fact that, the money that actually leaves the continent was about 4 times more than what money comes into the continent. So on an annual basis, we lose over 50 billion in illicit outflows of funds altogether. Wow. It's a lot, and a lot of the funds that actually leaves the continent is from the multinationals not paying their taxes, and also just corrupt money. So our government, some of the government, not all of them, and individuals just looking for a way around the system. Again, not paying their taxes. We can go beyond aid. We have everything, all that it takes. We're actually helping the Western countries to be rich, and because of our weak controls and the weak enforcement, the multinationals come in here and they see what they can get away with. They're not respecting our regulations. They're getting away with what they can because we are also doing it. We can go beyond aid, but it has to start, as I mentioned earlier, with the private sector. We can't, the government is doing their best, but it has to start with us. And one of the things that I mentioned in the article is that, the problem, we've had so many regulations, so many discussions, so many summits to discuss this whole issue, but nothing is being done, okay? But the problem is not, we have to look at the corruption as a means to a problem. Okay, so people are corrupt, or people do what they do because there is an issue and they're solving it with that behavior. So we have to first of all understand what the problem is and look for ways that alternative solutions that we can give to those people to solve that problem. Let me give a very simple example. If you have a child that is always crying for a dummy, for example, okay, or always putting their thumb in their mouth and crying. Whenever you take that thumb out, they're still crying. What do you do? The problem is they want something in their mouth and they just found the thumb as the most easiest option. So you find an alternative thing that they can put in their mouth in the meantime rather than their thumb. So
you swap it around with a dummy and then...
Yeah, so we can find ways where, and again, I always say that even if all the money was corrupt and it stayed within the African continent or it stayed in Ghana, it would still be a better place. So all the criminal money, I'm not saying criminal money is good, but it's going to better other people's countries. So if all the criminal money somehow still stayed within the country and they invested it, there will still be a trickle-down effect. So I think that's where the solution is and the situation we can begin to address. I propose that we actually begin to educate, I think from childhood. It should be part of the educational system in terms of the morals, certain things that we should be aware of. Even finance education should be given at a very young age, money management and in terms of, our whole moral system, the whole corruption, we could start educating people from childhood. But I think, again, a lot of it is awareness. A lot of companies in this part of the world don't quite understand the impact even on themselves. They feel like, okay, let me see what I can get away with. Why should I pay for compliance? I can make more profit if I didn't. But they realize that it comes to bite them. So again, taking the investors, a lot of companies don't realize the need of doing a lot of things until it gets to the point whereby they're trying to move their business to the next level and they're looking for investment. And then suddenly they meet these investors, foreign investors, and they're asking for all sorts, and they don't have it. Okay, so then they are set back like another year or two because they didn't do the right thing at the beginning. So I think we have to, like, individually, or each company needs to begin to address, and baby steps. They don't have to like invest millions from day one, but baby steps, and looking at the benefits. As I said, most people don't quite understand the benefit to themselves, to the business. And so in the month of July, I delivered a masterclass on due diligence to startups. So at the Oxford University Africa Conference, so I partnered with the Oxford University Innovation to deliver a masterclass, and it focused on financial due diligence. We had a lot of startups who came from Africa to be part of this masterclass, and a lot of the feedback that I had, they said, "Wow, this was eye-opener. We had no idea a lot of these things were that important." They've always felt like compliance is like a burden. It's almost like a punishment. The government wants them. It's just like rules and regulations that adds no value to their business. But when I highlighted the effects and the impact at a later stage, they thought, "Wow, nobody told us. We didn't know." So again, I think if we want to have a business that we are planning on our business to go to connect on a global stage, to be a global business, we need to begin to think about a lot of these issues from the very beginning, of the very start of the business.
In your dealings with businesses on the continent, would you say that there is the global mindset when people are starting businesses? Do they start businesses with the vision to play on a global field?
Not necessarily. That's not the experience I've had. Not really. A lot of them started, some of them by accident. I mean, I met somebody who started their business it was literally by accident. They were just, they had a hobby and they started and then it blew up, But most of them, I would say the African, again, the mindset, that's another thing. A lot of them don't start businesses hoping that it would go global. The ones that I've met at Oxford, because with Oxford, they train you to be a leader, an influencer. So they do start businesses on with the mindset of the global level. But the average person that I've met who started business in Africa, or we have worked with from the UK, they did not start. They didn't have that mindset. And I said, thank you that we can start beginning to think about when we are starting the business, that potentially this business could be a solution to millions of problems around the world, and you never know where it would lead. So we begin to start doing things the right way with the hope that if it did go on the global stage, I'll stand a better chance. Right.
Well, and I'm quite intrigued by the discovery that the masterclass did light up a few, bulbs for people, and the appreciation of why compliance is important, went up. Compliance, like you say, sometimes comes across as, the stick, and everyone seems to think that, okay, I would only do this because if I don't, I will be in trouble. Whereas from the indication I get, in the explanations you're given, it's actually akin to eat properly so you live long, as opposed to wait till you're overweight like me and then start trying to work out. How do we get that mindset corrected? What 2 or 3 things do you think ought to be done?
Education and awareness. Education, that's simply the answers. Education and awareness.
Who should be doing the education?
I mean, that's what EBII, we are here for. That's the purpose and the vision behind it. Eventually, we want to change the whole negative perception of Africa. We want the West to see Africa in a different light, and we want to begin to get Africans to begin to think in ways where we can individually change that. We've had a lot of African that we've done business with, and when we've requested for information to help us with our due diligence, there is a lot of kickback. A lot of them feel we're picking on them. They don't quite understand why we're asking for all this information. And I do understand that when we're dealing with the African businesses, we do an enhanced due diligence. So we go on above and beyond because we perceive the African businesses as high risk. okay, based on, again, the whole perception from the West. But I think until we understand ourselves, what the risk is within the continent, within our businesses, that is like the first step. So if we understand our risk, we can better position ourselves. We know exactly where our weaknesses are and what controls we have in place. And then we can then begin to have proper structures in place individually, each business, and then together we can help change that. But I think it will start, it's education and awareness. Education. A lot of them do know, but from my insight in terms of working in the banking sector and seeing exactly how the mindset over there and how they perceive Africa, and a lot of African businesses don't actually quite understand what the impact of their individual businesses and how they're not compliant is having on the wider Africa and Africa rising, I'll put it. You know, it's time they begin to have that awareness. So I'll say that.
You know, it's been said, and I don't know how true this is, because I haven't seen scientific evidence of it, but that the more women we have in the boardroom, the better for businesses, for compliance, for assurance. You're nodding. Means you agree. How does that translate? I've been trying to understand that.
I completely agree. We need to have more women in the boardroom, and the more women we have, the better. It's like the home, okay? So everybody is been programmed differently. Men are programmed in a particular way. Women are programmed, but in different way as well. And I would say women somehow, they're programmed, they have the emotional side of them. They are able to look at things from different perspectives that men may not be able to look at. And it's the same thing with different cultures. So in the UK, there's a big thing about inclusion. We have people from all backgrounds trying to engage them. And you'll be amazed. I mean, I've worked in teams whereby there were only one type of people in those teams. And I've worked in teams whereby it's very diverse. And the teams that I've worked in, that I've led, that has been diverse, it's been we've had better results. I'll give you an example. At City, when I first started my career, my boss was actually a woman, but she's an English lady. But it was myself, Ghanaian. We had a Nigerian person, we had an Irish person, an Indian person, an Italian lady, so there was a few men and a few women. But we won awards all the time in our team. Because of the fact that it's great minds coming together and we're looking at things from different angles, so we have better solutions to problems rather than being narrow focus. So,
you know, it seems that the point you just made buttresses something I read recently, that the future will be impacted greatly by what they call the 4 C's: the communication, collaboration, creativity, and critical thinking. Without collaboration, your team wouldn't have been able to achieve that.
Absolutely.
Diversity, therefore, is a good thing. But how do we push the diversity advantage in a place where culturally, though we celebrate our diversity, we tend to do it from a remote location. We tend not to mix too well. How do we make the conscious effort and cultivate that new mindset?
See, I personally think it's something that will slowly, over time, happen. We've come a long way. Even if you look in the West, and I think even Ghana, we have come a long way.
Right.
Women education and all of that. So it's a lot of it, I believe, has been they are driving from the Western part of the world, and because of media and TV programs and different ways, where somehow over time it will become the norm. So we'll slowly. I feel like we are not going to be the leading in this whole diversity thing, but over time we will somehow adjust and follow suit once we begin to see the impact and the result. But it's definitely something that is being driven from the West. And I think will continue to be driven from the West, just based on the fact that our culture just doesn't allow us to drive these things. It's like the Asian cultures is the same thing, but there's been a lot of changes. And I think if I look at Ghana, women when I left Ghana in '99, women education was something that they would do, send your girl child to school, advert on TV. And now, education is like free for up until a certain age, So for me, we're getting there. It's not something we can do overnight or you can force. I don't think we can force people, but it will be slowly adjusting to that. And I mean, there's been a lot of great Ghanaian influencers who are women that we look up to, even from the UK in this part of the world. And there's a lot in the UK. So there's slowly, again, as women are going to school, there's a lot of, in Oxford, there's a huge Ghanaian community there, and a lot of them are women. Some doing PhD. It's amazing. So as we get more and more of these people and being role models, I think over time.
When people get educated away from Ghana, the perception is that it's far easier for them to assimilate and adapt to the environment in which they receive the education, because the education lacks the contextual background of where we've come from and the challenges we have. How are you looking to bridge that gap as you look to come home and do something?
Absolutely. So I would say that people who actually started the education from here before they went, I don't think so much so, because I believe that the culture, like for me, I grew up here. I moved to the UK after JSS3. I've always seen myself as Ghanaian rather than British, although I'm British as well. So it really depends. Those who were born there, they've never been to Ghana before, they have never lived here. It's different. I don't think, so I kind of disagree a little bit in terms of the mindset. I've met a lot of Ghanaians at Oxford who are actually born in Ghana, who are studying over there. And they are more Ghanaian than I can think about. So I kind of, I don't think that statement is so true.
Okay.
So much, so that's my perspective on that.
We're going to take a final break in a moment, but before we do that, let's talk a little bit about the year of return. I mean, in 2018 at the UN General Assembly, the president said, look, he's declaring 2019 as the year of return. Diasporans, people of African descent and Ghanaians out there, come home, help us build. Good call?
Absolutely. I think it's a great call, and I really actually hope that other African countries begin to follow suit.
Have you seen from your perch anything that suggests that this good call will materialize and we'll see a major shift?
Yeah, so I mean, with the Oxford Africa Conference, that was one of the area of focus actually.
Okay.
The year of the return, and we had a little chat debate about that in terms of what does that mean? Is it a good idea? Is this really materializing? There's a lot of excitement. I mean, I'm very excited. This is one of the reasons why I thought, I'm going to use Ghana as my first pilot and actually come and explore. I've seen a lot of people come back home. A lot of my cohorts in Oxford actually are coming back home. I have colleagues in the banking sector actually who are looking to be home before the end of this year. So I've actually had a few people who said to me, Adjoa, when you go to Ghana, can you find out if there are any good jobs within the banking sector? I want to come back home. So there's a lot of excitement, speaking for the UK, among the Ghanaian communities about the whole year of return. We are suddenly feeling that the country is actually cares about what we have to bring on board. They're actually ready to receive what we have, acquire the wisdom, the knowledge, and how can we use that to change the country. So I've seen that. I think it's materializing already. It might not be so obvious yet because it's just this year, but over time I can see more people actually coming on board and flying back home.
All right.
Yes.
Well, we're going to take our break now, and when we come back, we'll be hitting the back straight with my guest, Adjoa Adjei-Twum. She's the founder and CEO of Emerging Business Intelligence and Innovation Compliance. More of the Executive Lounge in a moment. Welcome back to the Executive Lounge. I'm Adjoa Adjei. My guest is Adjoa Adjei-Twum. She is the founder and CEO of Emerging Business Intelligence and Innovation Compliance. compliant. Our conversation has been a lot about due diligence, about Africa's potential, and all of that. Now let's turn our attention to you as a person for a bit. Of course, you know, your career seemed to have evolved, and you've grown in leaps and bounds. Was it always, you know, quantum leaps for you?
So, I mean, when I started my career, I excelled very, very quickly up until a point. Then I had a setback. So so when I started my career, even with Citi, as I said, 2 weeks later I was promoted, and then we had the credit crunch. So then they let everybody go, including myself. Then I moved to another company. But 8 months down the line, Citibank calls me and said, "We have a role for you. Do you want to come back?" So I was the only person that was asked to come back. And when I went back, I was then, I'm a doer, so I love to spot areas where I can add value in any organization. And so I kind of put my hand up and I volunteered to keep track of all the regulatory development that goes on within the, you know, AML and financial crime compliance space, and to analyze this regulatory development and look at how that impacts us as a bank, especially within the private bank, and what do we need to do immediately and later in order to ensure that we are complying with those regulations. So I was then asked to go ahead and do that. So I was excited. So I would deliver a presentation every week in our team meetings and share with the CEO, and we had major changes as a result of that. So that was exciting. And then I moved to KPMG. KPMG, I mean, I was seconded right after, a month after I joined T Barclays as a manager looking at their financial crime sanctions. And as I said, I got awards. I got an award like 3 months down the line. We did an exciting piece of work. At the time, Barclays had gone through a fine, and the regulators were there. So my role was to do the BAU, the normal day-to-day, while they focus on liaising with the regulators. And that was exciting. Because of the work we did, they actually got rid of all the other consultants. So it was Deloitte at the time, and then they brought in KPMG. So we had the head of sanctions who then spoke at a KPMG away day and said they were very impressed with what we did. So they're bringing KPMG. So that's how KPMG relationship with Barclays started. And then I was then headhunted shortly after to HSBC again as a vice president. And then I had a bit of a setback. So I took a career, a slow turn. It was more of a family situation. And so then I had a bit of, Jonathan was little, my little boy was smaller, he was a baby then, so I took a bit of a slower pace. But then I rose again, and then became an associate.
How did you, I mean, and if you're quite happy to talk about what the setback was, how did you bounce back from that?
Oh, okay. So the setback was more of a tragedy within the family. So my personal situation changed overnight. Okay. And so there was a lot of things I couldn't do at the time. So my role with HSBC was I would be traveling across Europe because I was head of, so I was more manager for financial crime assurance for Europe. So a lot of things changed, and I couldn't actually do a lot of the things with my little boy being one, and so many things changed. So I decided to take a slower turn and go back one level down again and get a job that was more comfortable. Right. So I could sort of readjust. And so after I readjusted, I leaped twice within a space of a month. Okay. And so I was promoted twice I jumped from senior consultant to associate director, and there was another 2 rows in between, so like 3 levels leap. And then I went to study at Oxford. With Oxford as well, being a class rep and getting involved and doing a lot of things, it opened doors. When I came up with my business idea, I actually pitched it to the Oxford University, and they thought it was a very fascinating idea in terms of what EBI seeks to do in Africa. So they decided to partner with us. So we're actually in partnership with the Oxford University, and they've paid for all my startup costs. So everything that I needed to start a business, they covered it. My office space was given by them. The investors, the network that I need in order to excel in the business, they actually provided, which is a great start. And then again, with the team that I'm working with, they're all from, about 80% of them are actually from Oxford as well. Okay. So that's how it's been. And then right after my course at Oxford, I actually started working with Barclays again, but then this time as the global head of training and communication for their Chief Controller's Office. But before then, I did a piece of work as well for a bank called BFC Bank. So I was head of financial crime for their consumer business.
So you're Miss Compliance.
Yes, and I'm very passionate. Yeah, it's I love it, and I feel that you know, there is something that there's a problem, but there is a solution, and it takes each individual person. And so EBII, we're looking to work with the private sector and the government, and we are planning on hosting a very big summit, due diligence summit, end of this year or January. We are still finalizing the date, and we're going to be bringing in investors from this the Western world to share real insights of what puts them off on setting African businesses, and also we're bringing in a lot of subject matter experts, and we're trying to really get a conversation rolling and get some of the government officials involved.
That will be fascinating.
So
that will be fascinating.
Yeah.
It's been fantastic talking to you. Learned a thing or two.
So much.
You mentioned the terminology earlier on that I just want to be sure I got that right and our audience did. BAU, banking as usual?
Or business as usual.
Business as usual. All right. So that was more the operational part of the banking stuff, and you were focusing on the risk assurance.
Absolutely.
Good.
Yes.
All right. So 5 things I'm taking away from our conversation. Number 1 is that, and I'm going to start from the last thing I learned, which is more about bouncing back. It's readjustment. I think flexibility. That whatever life throws at you, there's still room for you to be able to readjust without losing focus of your overall vision. And that's something, if you can develop the spirit of flexibility so you can readjust to your situation and fit in no matter what comes your way. Number 2 is that you should constantly be looking for ways in which you can add value to environment. One of the reasons why Adjoa would have seen quite a lot of jumps in her career is because managers of businesses are constantly looking for value. If you can be a value bearer, if you can find places where you can add value, you will rise and you will get to a place of significance. Number 3 is that maintain passion. If you choose to learn something, you should follow it with a lot of passion. Look for ways in which you can be the best at what you do. She did that by, even though she was doing so well working, she thought, there's still more for me to do by way of bettering myself. So she went to school again. So that's the 3rd thing. And number 4 is that you should never stop talking about your ideas. More importantly, have those conversations with people who will appreciate it and encourage you. Not people who will kill your dreams, because whether you like it or not, there are dream killers out there.
Absolutely.
You know, and the final thing is that always remember where you've come from. Doing so well where you are, where you find yourself, you could have decided that's where I want to be and stay there, but somehow you've decided that you want to come back home and you want to do something. So
and value and help better our nation.
Absolutely, and you chose the year of return to do that.
Absolutely.
Good. Well, thank you so much, Adjoa, for
Thank you so
joining
much
us.
for having me on your show.
Super.
Thank you.
And for you, thank you very much for tuning in and watching us again. We'll be back again with some more on the Executive Lounge. Thanks to our friends at Villa Monticello and the crew and production team. Until the next edition, as always, go forward, make rain. Shalom. Is this something you learned? Were you born an entrepreneur?
You got to start small.
I have not allowed being a woman to hold me back.
Credibility is not just making money, it's about making sure that people trust what you're doing.
Law practice is not only about going to court, it's about advice.
It's very difficult to hire somebody who's not motivated and then make them motivated.
One of the things that I'm known for is integrity.
They have to see you as a person of integrity. It was